My question is aimed at the AG and also Minister Khoya. Minister Khoya talked about resourcefulness and innovation in moving forward, and I wholeheartedly commend that attitude. One of the areas in which I believe Fiji fails badly is assisting people to do major projects in this country. Dealing with one specific bank, they don't have enough money to lend you. And I remember 12 years ago, when we started doing our project, we actually had ANZ Fiji, we had ANZ New Zealand, and we had FDB, who joined together in pari passu, in that they ranked equally as first mortgagees. My feeling is we need someone else in this country, and I know AG, many years ago you talked about Fiji needed a merchant bank that could deal with someone like us who wants to go and borrow nearly $100 million. The only people in this country that would be anywhere near able to help us would be FNPF, and we understand that they have other priorities as well. We can create hundreds of jobs, we can bring in millions of dollars to Fiji. I am prepared to invest a lot more money in my project to happen. I'm convinced that there is a coming boom in real estate. I've been in real estate for 45 years and I've seen the troughs, the highs, the lows. COVID has gone down there and we're now going to come back. But we need help. We have a great project. AG, you did a very smart thing and you waived stamp duty on the purchase of goods. We want to sell a product which will be 2 years before people settle, but it will bring nearly $160 million into the country. What I'm a little worried about is that if I sell to all these people and we build these apartments, and then during the period of time of the building, the government waives the 10% concession, we would be leaving ourselves exposed. And I just seek your assurance that whilst this 10% concession is in and we're marketing off the plan, so to speak, that will still be in place when they come to settle in 2 years' time. So my other point was a merchant bank. I believe that the government should look at setting up a merchant bank, yet the government has the ability to borrow funds in the Middle East at a very low rate, could set up a merchant bank here and make a profit on those funds, lending it to people like me who can factor in those amounts. And I'm not decrying the banks. I've dealt with ANZ, Westpac, BSP, HFC. They're all really good banks, but their limitation is how much they can lend for major development. Thank you.
Well, it depends who's in government. If we're in government, of course. If we're in government, there won't be any stamp duties. No, I mean, look, on a more serious note, definitely that's our policy. We're not going to bring that about. In the same way, for example, we've got rid of business licenses. You don't need business licenses anymore. No, it would be silly to bring that back in. And, these measures that we've taken, for example, in particular the more fundamental ones, like stamp duty, like business license, those type of measures, when they're brought about, you don't actually chop and change that. Yes, you have things like ECAL, Environment Climate Adaptation Levy, that was reduced from 10 to 5%. STT is completely gone, Service Turnover Tax. Now, the reason, we do need ECAL, like I mentioned about climate change. And by law, ECAL, when we collect ECAL, that does not go directly into the pool of funds, into the consolidated fund. It actually has to be kept separately under law and applied only to do with the environment and climate adaptation. And by law, we actually have to publish every year where exactly the funds that have been collected from ECAL has gone to. As opposed to all other taxes that we do collect, they go to the general pool of funds, so a general revenue. In terms of venture capital finance, this is what we talked about some time back, about having some form of institution regarding that.
Yeah.
Government does not own any finance company. Government did have a National Bank of Fiji, which of course was lost. We do now have the first Fijian-owned bank, Home Finance, which is the smallest bank, owned by FNPF and the Unit Trust of Fiji. I would have thought, in our discussions when we had at that point in time, in the discussion with all the different banks, that perhaps the banks and the various institutions can come together, and set aside a certain percentage contribution and set up a venture capital, entity, which perhaps government could participate in that. But you cannot expect government at this point in time to carry the burden, to have, $100 million, $300 million available for specific projects, which the mainstream banks do not want to finance. I mean, let's be realistic about it. We have to fund free education. Everybody complains about potholes, COVID or no COVID. People need water. The amount of water rates that people pay, even commercial rates, is not even enough to pay for the cost of producing that water. We all know that. People use water for car wash and they make a commercial there's a commercial venture. The rates being paid is very low. We fund $200 million a year to Water Authority of Fiji. We have an aging infrastructure. Water pipes that were put in by the colonial governments. No government previously had the rebuild or rehabilitation of those water pipes. We're now having to bear the burden, particularly in the Suvarnasori corridor, where you have a huge influx of people living in a very limited space because, for example, of leases not being renewed, etc. So everybody's sort of squattering in those areas. And so there's a huge sort of burgeoning of the population, enormous pressure on the infrastructure. So we've got the Viria water project, over $200-300 million project, which will come on stream next year, in the middle of next year, which will in fact give us more water than we actually require currently, which will solve the water problem of the greater Suva area. That's really our focus. We cannot be setting aside $200 million, government alone, to set up a venture capital company. The banks need to participate. This is what I was talking about earlier on. If the private sector actually rallies around these kind of from a national perspective, the ANZs and the Westpacs and the Barodas, the BSPs, the bread banks and the HFCs and BSPs all sort of set aside 10%, maybe FNPF might even join. And that could be an entity that could actually lend money to, maybe sort of high risk or non-mainstream, financing. That would be the approach.
I think we need it, actually. We really do.
I absolutely agree with you. Let's talk to the banks. Let's start with ANZ.
Yeah, let give it to Rob.
So I don't think size is going to be solved by bringing a merchant bank in. I've spent most of my career in merchant investment banking before I joined ANZ. And actually their credit policies are far tighter than commercial banks. Investment banks don't like lending. They like charging mergers and acquisition fees, right? Or IPO equity listing fees. That's what merchant banks are all about. So I don't think size is the issue. Our largest exposures would be $200 million plus. And the developed market approach for large exposures is to have multiple banks collaborating in a syndicated loan format. So that's something that's available in Fiji today. We executed that structure for EFL a couple of years ago. It's a pretty public transaction, multiple banks working together, but the deal has to be bankable. So I don't think there's a lack of firepower. I often remind Arif that we've got $1.1 billion sitting with him at the moment, earning zero. So we'd love to deploy that in the right projects. It's just a case of finding the right projects.